My arms, somebody help me, please. Don't touch anything. I need bandages now. This water was boiling. It doesn't end up on a grown woman's arms by accident. She's just a child, sir. Then explain the bowl in her hands. Before we rewind 3 weeks, I want to say thank you to everyone who's been rocking with this channel. Your support means more than you know. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe, tap that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We might just shout you out in the next video. All right, now let's go back 3 weeks, to the morning this all began. I can't stay in this house another day. No salary is worth this. That's the 9th one this year, sir. The 9th resignation letter in 6 months. 9. Why does every single one of them run? Across town, at the gates of Hanseng Preparatory, that laughter had a mirror. So what happened to the new girl your father hired? Hanul asked, linking her arm through Myre's like the two of them on the sidewalk beneath their feet. Did you really make her clean the same floor 4 times? Myre didn't even slow her walk. She lifted her chin the way she always did when she wanted an audience, and the small crowd around her leaned in like moths finding a porch light. 5, she corrected, and the group burst into laughter loud enough to turn heads across the courtyard. She thought a little mud was going to break her. I had to teach her better. Somewhere behind that laughter, if anyone had bothered to look closely, they might have noticed that Myre's smile never quite reached her eyes. But nobody looked closely. Nobody ever did. They saw the watch, the car, the last name that opened doors across Seoul, and they mistook all of it for a girl who had everything. Miles away, behind the high walls of the Seo estate, Seo Kai-jun sat at his desk with a stack of paper in front of him that had grown far too familiar. 9 letters. 9 different names, 9 different handwritings, but the same sentence buried somewhere in each one. I am no longer able to continue my employment. He didn't need to read them twice anymore. He knew them by heart. His butler stood near the door, hands folded, waiting the way a man waits when he already knows the conversation is going to be uncomfortable. 9, Kai-jun said, not looking up. 6 months and 9 women have walked out of this house. Yes, sir. Do you know what people are saying about this family in the agencies now? The butler hesitated. I've heard some of it, sir. Then you understand why I'm not laughing. Kai-jun set the letter down and finally lifted his eyes. There was no anger in them, not yet, just the tired weight of a man who had built an empire out of discipline and could not seem to apply a single ounce of it inside his own home. She's my daughter. I love her. But love isn't the same as blindness, and I refuse to keep pretending I don't see what's happening in this house. She's grieving, sir. She's been grieving for 3 years, Kai-jun said quietly. At some point, grief becomes an excuse. I won't let her hide behind her mother's memory forever, and I certainly won't let her keep destroying the lives of women who did nothing but show up and try to work. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the low hum of the estate's climate system and the distant sound of gardeners trimming hedges outside. Then Kai-jun said the sentence that would matter more than either of them realized in that moment. Find someone new, someone who won't scare easily. If this next one leaves too, I want to know exactly why, and I want Myre in this office to explain it to my face. The butler bowed and left, and here is the question worth sitting with, the one nobody in that house had thought to ask yet. If 9 grown women, trained, experienced, some of them having worked in far harder homes than this one, couldn't survive a season under one teenage girl's temper. What exactly was Myre so afraid would happen if somebody finally did stay? There was a saying that passed quietly between the domestic workers of Seoul, that no paycheck, however generous, was worth setting foot inside the Seo estate. Behind its reinforced gates and manicured hedges lived one of the most feared men in the country, syndicate boss Seo Kai-jun. But even his money and his muscle couldn't fix the one problem that lived under his own roof. 9 women had walked out in under a year, and every letter that reached his desk carried the same quiet warning between the lines. His daughter would not let anyone stay. Across the city, in a cramped employment office that smelled like old coffee and copier toner, a young woman sat in a plastic chair with her resume pressed flat against her knee, smoothing out a wrinkle that wasn't really there. Her name was Kisa Kane, and she had rehearsed this moment more times than she wanted to admit. The posture, the handshake, the steady voice that didn't let on how much she needed this particular job to say yes. She was 3 semesters from finishing her culinary degree. 3 semesters, and a tuition balance that grew heavier every time she checked her account. Back home, there was no family cushion waiting to catch her if she fell short, just her own 2 hands, her own discipline, and a promise she'd made to herself the day she watched her father's restaurant close its doors for the last time. One day, I'll open one that never has to close. That promise didn't pay tuition on its own. A paycheck did. The woman at the front desk called a name, and Kisa stood, straightening her blouse, and walked forward like a woman who had learned a long time ago that composure was armor, and she intended to wear hers well. "I saw the listing for the CO estate," she said. "I'd like to apply." The woman behind the desk paused with her pen halfway to the paper, and something flickered across her face. Not quite a warning, not quite pity, but close enough to both that Kisa noticed it immediately. "You know that position has turned over 9 times this year," the woman said carefully. "I heard," Kisa answered. "Most people hear that and walk right back out that door." Kisa allowed herself the smallest, steadiest smile, the kind that had gotten her through double shifts, through a father's funeral, through a plane ride alone to a country where she didn't yet know a soul. "I'm not most people. I need the work, and I don't scare as easily as people think I should." The woman studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded and began filling out the paperwork. And somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable office, with nothing but fluorescent lighting and the smell of stale coffee to mark the occasion, the 2 halves of this story, the girl guarding a grave that wasn't even a grave, and the woman who refused to be run off by anybody's grief, moved 1 step closer to the collision that would change both of their lives. Now let's sit with this for a second, because this is the part that should make your blood simmer a little. 9 women. 9. Grown, capable, hardworking women who walked through those gates trying to earn an honest living, and 1 spoiled child made it her personal mission to break every single one of them down until they had no choice but to leave. That's not acting out. That's not just a phase. That is cruelty with intention, dressed up in designer clothes and excused because a man with money didn't want to discipline his own child. If that made something rise up in your chest just now, if you felt that flicker of "oh," absolutely not, don't swallow it. Type, "not another one," in the comments right now, so this child knows there's a whole room of women watching who are not about to let her keep getting away with it. And before we follow Kisa through those gates for the first time, I want to pull you aside for just a moment, one storyteller to a friend. If today's chapter stirred something in you, that particular ache of watching cruelty and grief tangled up together, wondering which one is going to win, I have 2 more stories waiting for you that will take you even deeper into that same feeling. One will absolutely break your heart before it puts it back together. The other will remind you what healing looks like when it finally arrives, slow and hard-earned, the way real healing always does. Both of them live in the same collection, and it's ready for you right now, full novels, a free audiobook included, and every future release in the series folded into that same download. If you're reading this from your phone or your computer, the link is waiting for you in the description box and pinned right at the top of the comments. 1 tap and it's yours. And if you're relaxing on your couch tonight, television remote in hand, just lift your phone, open that camera, and scan the gold QR code sitting right there on your screen. Let it carry you home to a story that stays with you. Now back to that mansion behind the high walls, where a young woman named Kisa Kane is about to walk through iron gates 9 other women couldn't survive, carrying nothing but a suitcase, a culinary school transcript, and a kind of quiet steel that Myray CO has never once had to face. The gates of the CO estate rose taller than Kisa had imagined from the photographs, iron and stone standing like a warning nobody had bothered to write down, because everyone in Seoul already knew it by heart. She stood at the intercom for a moment longer than necessary, not out of fear, but out of respect, the same respect she gave any kitchen the first time she walked into it, sizing up the room before she ever picked up a knife. A guard checked her name against a list, nodded once, and the gates parted. The walk up the drive took longer than she expected, past manicured hedges cut into shapes too precise to be anything but expensive, past a fountain that probably cost more than her tuition twice over. She kept her shoulders back and her suitcase steady in her hand, and she reminded herself, quietly, the way she had reminded herself 100 times on the flight over from home. You have survived harder rooms than this one. Seo Kaijun met her in the receiving hall himself, which she hadn't expected. Most employers of his standing sent a manager, a housekeeper, someone whose time mattered less. But he stood there in a dark suit, hands folded behind his back, studying her the way a man studies a decision he isn't fully sure of yet. "Miss Kane," he said, "you understand the position you're applying for has a difficult history." "I do, sir. 9 women have left this house in less than a year, not because the work was hard, because my daughter made it unbearable." He said it plainly, without flinching, and something about his honesty settled a little of the tension in Kisa's shoulders. A man who could admit that much about his own household, she thought, was not a man hiding from the truth. "I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. I appreciate you telling me directly. Most people don't want the truth. They want to be told it'll be different this time." "I don't need it to be easy, sir," Kisa said. "I need it to be honest. I can work with honest." Kaijun studied her a moment longer, and Kisa held his gaze without arrogance and without apology, the way she'd learned to hold a supervisor's gaze back home when she needed him to know she wasn't going to be talked past. Something in his expression shifted, not quite approval, but the beginning of it. "There are boundaries I intend to set from today," Kisa continued, before he could speak again. "I'll do my work well, and I'll do it with respect. But I won't be spoken to as though I'm beneath this house, and I won't tolerate being tested past what any reasonable person should have to endure. If your daughter has a grievance with the world, sir, I'm happy to be patient with her. I won't be anyone's punching bag." It was a bold thing to say to a man like Seo Kaijun, in a house like this one, on her very first day. But Kisa Kane had learned a long time ago that dignity offered up front cost far less than dignity clawed back later, and she would rather lose the job on her own terms than keep it by shrinking herself smaller and smaller until there was nothing left to protect. Kaijun's mouth curved just slightly into something that wasn't quite a smile but wanted to be one. "Fair enough, Miss Kane, fair enough." He turned toward the hallway. "The housekeeper will show you to the staff quarters. I wish you luck." And here, unspoken, was the question sitting quietly underneath his words. One he didn't say aloud, but Kisa could feel all the same. "How long will your dignity survive in this house before my daughter finds a way to break it?" She was given the afternoon to settle her things and learn the layout of the kitchen. A room so large and gleaming it looked more suited to a 5-star hotel than a private residence. Stainless steel counters stretched from wall to wall, hanging racks of copper pots catching the light. A walk-in pantry stocked better than some restaurants she'd trained in back home. For the first time all day, something in her chest eased. Whatever else this house held, the kitchen, at least, spoke a language she understood fluently. She spent the better part of an hour scrubbing the tile floor near the pantry entrance, on her knees with a brush, working a stubborn patch of grime left over from whatever crew had come through before her. By the time she finished, the floor gleamed, catching the overhead light in a clean, satisfying shine. The kind of small, honest accomplishment that had always meant something to her, even when nobody else was watching to notice. Someone was watching. Maid stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching Kisa work with the flat, assessing stare of someone taking inventory of a threat. She said nothing at first. She simply waited until Kisa rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to gather her supplies. And in that exact moment, Maid stepped forward deliberately and dragged the sole of her shoe across the length of the freshly cleaned floor, tracking a long, dark smear of mud from one end to the other. She did it slowly. She wanted Kisa to see. "Oops," Maid said, not even bothering to sound sincere. Kisa looked down at the floor, then back up at the girl standing in front of her, small, sharp-eyed, dressed in clothes that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, wearing an expression that dared her to react. Kisa recognized the look immediately. She'd seen it before in different faces, different rooms, different countries. The look of someone who had learned that cruelty, delivered with enough confidence, usually got mistaken for power. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't give the girl a single flicker of the satisfaction she was clearly hunting for. "All right," Kisa said simply, and knelt back down with her brush. Myre's eyebrows lifted, just slightly, thrown off by the absence of a reaction. She lingered in the doorway a moment longer, watching Kisa scrub the same stretch of floor a second time with the same calm, unhurried thoroughness she'd shown the first time, as though the mud were simply weather, an inconvenience with no author behind it at all. "You know I did that on purpose," Myre said, when the silence stretched a beat too long for her liking. "I know," Kisa said, not looking up. "And you're not going to say anything about it." "What would you like me to say?" Myre opened her mouth, then closed it again because the truth was she didn't have an answer ready. Every maid before this one had reacted, some with tears, some with anger, one with a shouted threat to quit on the spot before she'd even finished her first week. Myre had a whole arsenal built for those reactions. She had nothing built for this. "You won't last past Sunday," Myre said finally, retreating to the only weapon she had left. "Foreign maids never do. This house eats people like you." Kisa finished the last corner of the floor, rose, and met the girl's eyes without a trace of anger in her own, only a steadiness that seemed, somehow, more unsettling to Myre than fury would have been. "I'm not here to fight a child," she said quietly. "I'm here to work. If you want a war, you'll have to find someone else willing to give you one." For a long moment, Myre simply stared at her, and something flickered across her face that she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite anger, not quite confusion, something closer to the uncomfortable sensation of standing on ground that wasn't behaving the way it always had before. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps sharp and fast against the marble, leaving Kisa alone in a spotless kitchen with a mop still dripping quietly in the bucket beside her. Later that evening, one of the household staff would mention it to another in the hush of the servants' corridor, the story already taking on the shape of legend the way these things do in houses full of watching eyes. "She didn't even flinch when the girl stepped on the floor," the maid whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "Just cleaned it again. Didn't say a word." Word has a way of traveling fast in a house like the CO estate, and by the time the sun went down, everyone from the gardeners to the guards at the gate had heard some version of the same astonishing rumor, that the new maid hadn't broken. Not on day one, not even close. But upstairs, behind a closed bedroom door, Myre sat on the edge of her bed with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring at nothing. Replaying the moment over and over in her mind, the calm in that woman's voice, the absence of fear in her eyes, and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation of not knowing exactly what to do next. That unfamiliar feeling didn't stay unwelcome for long. By morning, Myre had already decided what to do with it. She would push harder, because pushing had always worked before, and a girl who had never once needed a plan B saw no reason to build one now. It started small, the way it always did with her, small enough that no one could ever quite prove intention. The laundry room door, which should have opened with a simple twist of the handle, was locked tight when Kisa arrived with an armful of linens, and stayed locked for the better part of an hour until one of the groundskeepers happened to walk by with a spare key, muttering under his breath about doors that were never locked before. Kisa said nothing. She simply waited, arms full, patience intact, and went about her work the moment the door finally opened. Then it was the knives. A full prep set, sharpened and organized the way Kisa always left them at the end of her shift, gone from their block entirely when she came down for the morning meal service, forcing her to hunt through drawers and cabinets for nearly 20 minutes while the clock on breakfast preparation ticked steadily against her. She found them eventually, shoved carelessly into the back of a cabinet meant for serving trays, and she said nothing about that either, only put them back where they belonged and got to work, the whole encounter costing her time she didn't have to spare and giving Myre, watching from the hallway, no satisfaction whatsoever. It was the words, finally, that Myre seemed to enjoy sharpening the most. "My father says people like you come here because there's nothing left for you back home," she said one afternoon, trailing Kisa through the kitchen with the lazy, circling confidence of someone who had never once been told to stop. "Is that true? Is that why you're so far from wherever you're from, cleaning up after people who actually have something?" Kisa kept her hands steady on the cutting board, kept her breathing even, kept her eyes on the vegetables in front of her rather than on the girl clearly hunting for a reaction. "I'm here because I earned a place in a culinary program, and I'm working to pay for it," she said evenly. "That's the whole story. No tragedy required." "That's not what I heard." "Then you heard wrong." Myray's jaw tightened at the calm in Kisa's voice, that same maddening, unshakable calm that had followed her through every single test Myray had thrown at her so far. Nothing landed. Nothing stuck. Every insult slid off this woman like rain off glass, and somewhere underneath Myray's frustration, a smaller, quieter voice had started asking a question she didn't want to answer. What is it that makes her so hard to break? What does she know that I don't? That question would have to wait, because on the third afternoon, something in Myray finally reached its limit. The kitchen was busy with dinner preparation, steam rising off 2 pots at once, the low hiss of oil heating in a pan on the far burner, Kisa moving between counters with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent years learning how to make a kitchen feel like an extension of her own hands. She had just pulled a large metal bowl of water off the stove, water she'd been heating to blanch vegetables, still rolling with a faint, dangerous simmer, and set it carefully on the prep table to cool for a moment before she used it. Myray appeared in the doorway the way she always did, silent and sudden, watching Kisa work with that same flat, assessing stare. And for reasons that would take Myray years to fully untangle, the humiliation of being unable to break this woman, the frustration of watching every trap fail, the deep, buried, aching fear that had absolutely nothing to do with Kisa Kane and everything to do with a mother who had disappeared long before her daughter was ready to lose her. Something in Myray simply snapped. She crossed the kitchen in 3 fast strides, grabbed the metal bowl off the prep table before Kisa even registered the movement, and hurled the scalding water directly at her. It happened too fast for either of them to stop it. The liquid arced through the air and caught Kisa full across both forearms, a sudden, blistering wave of heat that tore a scream from her throat before she even understood what had happened. She staggered back, clutching her arms to her chest, the skin already reddening, already rising into angry welts beneath her sleeves, and for one long, suspended second, the kitchen went completely silent except for the ragged sound of her own breathing. Myray stood frozen with the empty bowl still in her hands, staring at what she'd done as though she, too, couldn't quite believe it, as though some part of her had expected the water to simply miss, the way a child throwing a tantrum sometimes expects consequences to somehow not apply to them. It was in that exact moment that Seo Kaijun stepped into the doorway. He had been passing through the hall on his way to his study when the scream reached him, sharp and unmistakable, cutting clean through the thick walls of his own home. He crossed the threshold expecting an accident, a dropped pan, a knife slip, something the household staff could handle on their own. What he found instead stopped him cold. His daughter, standing utterly still with an empty metal bowl in her trembling hands. His new maid, doubled over the prep table, clutching scorched, reddening arms, tears streaming down her face as she fought to keep from screaming again. "Is that boiling water in her hands?" The words left him before he'd even fully processed the scene, his voice low and disbelieving, his eyes moving from the steam still rising faintly off Kisa's burned skin to the bowl resting in his daughter's unrepentant grip. "Sir, she—" one of the kitchen staff started, rushing forward toward Kisa, but Kaijun's attention had already narrowed entirely onto his daughter, and the look on his face was one none of the staff had ever seen directed at Myray before. Not frustration, not weary disappointment, something colder, something final. "Explain this to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Explain this to me right now." Myray opened her mouth, and nothing came out. For the first time in her life, there was no clever excuse ready, no cool deflection, no easy laugh to smooth the moment over. She simply stood there, the bowl still clutched in her hands, staring at the woman she had just burned, and felt the full, undeniable weight of what she had done settle over her like a stone. "Someone call the medics," Kaijun said sharply, already moving toward Kisa, his voice cutting through the frozen stillness of the kitchen. "Now, I don't care what it costs, I don't care who you have to wake up, call them now." The staff scattered into motion, one rushing for the phone, another grabbing a clean towel and cool water, someone else pulling a chair forward for Kisa to sit before her legs gave out beneath her. Through the blur of pain and adrenaline, Kisa caught one last look at Maid still standing frozen in the middle of the kitchen. And in that girl's wide, stricken eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected to find there. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but the raw, unguarded horror of a child who had finally, truly understood that some lines, once crossed, can never quite be crossed back over. Kaijun turned to his daughter one final time before following the staff toward the door, and his voice, when it came, was low enough that only she could hear it. "You have no idea," he said, "what you have just done to this family." And here is where I need to pause and ask you directly, because this is the part of the story that deserves your voice, not just your silence. A grown woman, working an honest job, burned by a child who never once faced a single consequence for her cruelty until this exact moment. If you believe Maid deserved to lose every comfort she has ever known after what she just did, I want you to type "justice" in the comments right now. Let her know, and let every viewer scrolling past know, that there is a whole room of women watching who will not let this slide. Because in the chapter ahead, Seo Kaijun is about to make a decision that will strip his daughter of everything she has ever taken for granted, and force her to spend every single day looking directly into the eyes of the woman she hurt. Maid had no idea what those words meant, not really, not in the moment they were spoken, but she would understand them fully within the hour, once her father returned to that kitchen alone. He came back after the medics had gone. After Kisa had been settled into a guest room near the staff quarters with her arms wrapped in gauze and a mild sedative easing her into sleep. After the last of the kitchen staff had finished scrubbing down the counters and mopping up the water that had splashed across half the floor. Kaijun walked through the room slowly, taking in every detail, the overturned metal bowl still sitting where it had landed, the faint scorch marks where the water had struck the prep table, the empty space on the counter where Kisa's knife roll usually sat, untouched all evening because she'd never had the chance to use it. He picked up the bowl and turned it over in his hands, and something in his chest went cold and still, the way it used to go cold and still years ago when he was a younger man learning exactly how far violence could travel before it stopped being business and started being something else entirely. He set the bowl down gently, deliberately, and walked upstairs. Maid was sitting on the edge of her bed when he opened her door without knocking, still in the same clothes she'd been wearing in the kitchen, staring at nothing the way she had the night before, except this time there was no room left for the girl to hide behind confusion. She knew exactly what she'd done. She had simply decided in the hours since that she wasn't going to feel bad about it. "Do you have anything to say to me?" Kaijun asked, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, his voice quieter than she'd braced herself for, which somehow made it worse. "She wouldn't stop staring at me like she thought she was better than everyone in this house," Maid said, lifting her chin the same way she had at school, the same way she had her entire life whenever she needed to convince herself she was in control of a room. Maybe now she understands her place. For a long moment, Kaijun said nothing at all. He simply looked at his daughter, really looked at her, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in longer than he wanted to admit, and what he saw wasn't defiance so much as a child so buried under her own grief and entitlement that she genuinely believed what she'd just said. That frightened him more than any tantrum ever could have. Her place, he repeated slowly, was doing an honest day's work in a house that promised her fair treatment. Yours, apparently, was deciding that a burn was an acceptable way to remind her she didn't belong here. He shook his head, and something in his expression hardened into a decision. "You have shown me exactly who you've become, Maid, and I am done pretending I haven't seen it." "She's a maid," Maid said, some old, worn-out defiance still trying to claw its way back to the surface. "You're acting like I hurt someone who matters." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Myrae had ever heard in her life. "Give me your phone," Kaijun said. Myrae blinked. "What?" "Your phone's now." She hesitated only a second before handing it over, some instinct in her recognizing that this was not a moment to test him further, though she still didn't fully understand what was happening. Kaijun pocketed it without another glance. "Your accounts are frozen as of tonight," he continued, his voice flat and final, the voice of a man who had run an empire on decisions exactly like this one for 20 years, and had simply never before turned that same discipline toward his own child. No allowance, no cards, no car, no driver waiting outside the school gates. From this moment forward, you will earn every single thing you use in this house, the same way every other person under this roof has always had to. "You can't be serious." Myrae's voice cracked, the first real fracture in her composure since the kitchen. "This is insane. I'm your daughter. You're also the reason a woman is lying in a guest room tonight with burns on both arms," Kaijun said. "So yes, I am entirely serious." He let that settle for a moment before he continued. And here, unspoken beneath the discipline in his voice, sat a question that would linger over the rest of this story, one Myrae herself hadn't yet thought to ask. If her father was willing to go this far over a maid he'd known less than a week, what exactly did that say about how much this particular woman had already come to mean to him? "Starting tomorrow morning," Kaijun said, "you will report to the kitchen at 6 o'clock. You will wear the plain uniform every other member of staff in this house wears. And you will work directly under Miss Kane's supervision, doing every task she assigns you, for as long as it takes her to fully recover from what you did to her." Myrae stared at him as though he'd started speaking a language she no longer understood. "From today," he said, and the words landed in the room like a verdict, "you are the maid of this house. You can't do this to me." "I can, and I have." "You're punishing me by making me serve the woman Myrae stopped herself, but the sentence hung there anyway, unfinished and damning. "You're forcing me to work for a servant." "I'm forcing you," Kaijun said, stepping closer, his voice dropping lower and harder than she had ever heard it, "to serve the woman you tried to hurt. And if any part of you still believes that's beneath you, then you have understood absolutely nothing about the man who raised you." Myrae shot to her feet, fury and disbelief warring across her face in equal measure. "I won't do it. You can't keep me in this house against my will." "You're welcome to try leaving," Kaijun said calmly, already turning toward the door. "But I'd think carefully before you do." She tested him within the hour, storming down the main staircase with a small bag hastily packed, fully intending to prove to herself, if no one else, that her father's threats carried no real weight. She made it as far as the front entrance before two of the household guards stepped quietly into her path, blocking the door with the same calm, unmovable presence they used for anyone who threatened the family's security, except this time that anyone was her. "Move," Myrae said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be, laced with the first thread of real panic she'd felt all night. "Mr. CO's orders, miss," one of the guards said, not unkindly, but without a single flicker of hesitation. "You're not to leave the property." Myrae stood frozen in the entryway, staring at two men who had spent her entire life protecting her, now standing squarely between her and the only life she'd ever known. It was in that exact moment, more than anything her father had said upstairs, that the full weight of her situation finally landed. This wasn't a lecture. This wasn't a punishment that would blow over by morning the way it always had before. "You took everything from me," she whispered, more to herself than to the guards, "for a servant." Somewhere above her, unseen, Kaijun stood at the top of the staircase watching the scene unfold exactly as he'd known it would, his expression unreadable, his heart heavier than he would ever let his daughter see. He had built an empire on knowing precisely how far to push a person before they broke in the wrong direction entirely. And he prayed, standing there in the dim light of his own hallway, that he hadn't just made the gravest miscalculation of his life with the one person in this world he couldn't afford to lose. "Now I want to hear from you directly, because this is exactly the kind of decision that splits a room in real life, and I want to know where you stand. If your own child did something this cruel to another human being, burned someone, truly hurt them, and showed no remorse for it, would you have done what Kaijun just did? Would you have stripped away the money, the comfort, the privilege, and made her serve the very person she hurt until she understood the weight of it? Tell me honestly in the comments below. Because in the chapter ahead, Myrae wakes up for her very first morning as a maid in her own home, and she is about to discover that scrubbing a floor is nothing compared to standing face to face with the woman she burned. That prayer would go untested for exactly 6 hours, because by 5:30 the next morning, Myrae Seo was standing in the doorway of the kitchen in a plain gray uniform 2 sizes too big for her, staring at a rice cooker as though it had personally insulted her. She hadn't slept much. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the reality of her situation had finally settled over her, not as a lecture she could argue her way out of, not as a punishment that would quietly dissolve by morning, but as an actual schedule, written out by her father's own hand and taped to the inside of her bedroom door. 5:30 report to kitchen. 6:00 begin breakfast prep under Miss Kane's supervision. 7:00 laundry. 8:00 floors. She'd read it 4 times before she believed it was real. Kisa was already there when Myrae arrived, seated on a stool near the counter with both forearms wrapped in fresh gauze, moving carefully but capably despite the injury, directing a junior kitchen assistant through the early stages of breakfast with the same calm authority she brought to everything. When she saw Myrae hovering in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or turn around and test the guards at the front door one more time, she simply gestured toward the counter beside her. "Rice first," Kisa said, as though this were the most ordinary morning in the world, as though the girl standing in front of her hadn't hurled boiling water across a kitchen table 2 days earlier. 2 cups, rinsed until the water runs mostly clear. Not perfectly clear, mostly. Myrae stared at her. "You want me to wash rice?" "I want you to make breakfast," Kisa said. "Washing rice is where breakfast starts." There was no venom in her voice, no satisfaction, nothing that resembled the reaction Myrae had braced herself for all night. She had expected coldness. She had expected, if she were honest, a small measure of cruelty returned in kind. A woman finally getting the chance to look down on the girl who had scalded her, and Myrae had steeled herself to endure it because some stubborn part of her believed she deserved it. Instead, Kisa simply handed her a colander and pointed toward the rice bin, patient as a tide. Myrae rinsed the rice badly. She rinsed it so badly, in fact, that half of it went down the drain before she figured out how to hold the colander at the right angle. And what remained in the pot came out that morning as a scorched, gluey mess stuck permanently to the bottom of the cooker, filling the kitchen with a faint burnt smell that made 2 of the other staff exchange a glance they were careful not to let Myrae see. "It's ruined," Myrae said, staring down at the pot with something between embarrassment and defiance, waiting for the reprimand she was certain was coming. "It's a first try," Kisa said instead, rising slowly from her stool despite the discomfort still evident in her bandaged arms, walking over to inspect the damage without a trace of irritation on her face. "Rice doesn't cook itself just because you're rich, and it doesn't punish you for not knowing how, either. It just needs more water next time and a lower flame. Scrape it out, we'll start again." Myrae scraped it out. It took 20 minutes and left her hands raw from scrubbing at the scorched bottom of the pot, and by the time she finished, her arms ached in places she hadn't known could ache from something as simple as housework. The morning did not improve from there. She burned the first pan of eggs so badly that smoke curled up toward the vent fan, setting off a small chorus of coughing from the staff nearby. And when she tried to salvage the second attempt by turning the heat up higher instead of lower, she burned that one even worse. By the time she moved on to laundry, her palms had already begun to blister from the unfamiliar friction of scrubbing and wringing. And by the time floors came around at 8 o'clock, she was on her knees with a brush in her raw hands, sweat beading at her hairline, wondering with genuine, bewildered fury how anyone survived doing this kind of work every single day of their lives. It was somewhere in the middle of scrubbing that same stretch of tile, the same stretch she had once deliberately mudded just to watch a stranger clean it twice, that something in Myrae finally cracked, not from remorse yet, but from sheer, bone-deep frustration. "Why aren't you yelling at me?" she demanded, sitting back on her heels and glaring up at Kisa, who had settled into a chair nearby to peel vegetables with hands still healing from injuries Myrae herself had caused. "I burned your arms. I ruined your morning for weeks. You could make my life absolutely miserable right now, and instead you're just sitting there, teaching me how to wash rice like none of it happened." Kisa set down the vegetable she was peeling and looked at Myrae for a long moment, unhurried, the way she looked at everything. "What would yelling accomplish?" she asked, and it wasn't rhetorical. She seemed genuinely curious about the answer. "I don't know. Satisfaction, maybe." "For a minute," Kisa agreed. "Maybe two. And then what? You'd hate me a little more, do your chores a little worse, and neither one of us would be any closer to where we're supposed to end up." She picked the vegetable back up, resuming the slow, careful rhythm of her work despite the bandages. "I didn't come to this country to spend my energy hatting a teenager. I came here to become a chef. Yelling at you doesn't get me any closer to that, so I'm not interested in wasting the breath." Myrae had no response for that. She turned back to the floor and scrubbed in silence for a while, and here, quietly, in the middle of that silence, was the question that had started following her everywhere without her permission. If this woman had every right in the world to hate her and simply didn't, what exactly did that make Myrae, who had hated her for no reason at all? The morning's final disaster came just before 9, when Myrae, still raw-handed and exhausted, attempted to stack a set of ceramic serving dishes the way she'd seen the household staff do 100 times, without ever once considering how it was actually done. The stack shifted the moment she lifted it, one dish sliding against another at the wrong angle, and before she could steady it, 3 plates slipped from her hands and shattered against the tile in a sharp, echoing crash that brought half the kitchen staff running. Myrae stood frozen amid the wreckage, waiting, truly waiting, braced in a way she hadn't been all morning, for the anger she felt certain was finally coming. 3 plates. Expensive ones, the kind her father favored for formal service. Surely this was the moment Kisa's patience ran out. Instead, Kisa rose from her chair, crossed the kitchen slowly, and knelt down beside her, gathering the broken pieces into her palm with the same steady, unbothered calm she brought to everything, bandaged arms and all. "I've broken 3 plates," Myrae said quietly, almost to herself, staring at the woman kneeling beside her instead of at the mess on the floor, and she just smiled. "They're just plates," Kisa said, handing her a broom without a hint of frustration in her voice. "Nobody in this kitchen has ever been more important than a piece of ceramic, and they never will be, not on my watch. Sweep the rest and let's move on." Myrae took the broom with hands that were shaking slightly, though she couldn't have said whether it was from exhaustion or something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably close to the beginning of shame. She swept in silence, and somewhere in that silence, for the very first time since the water had left that metal bowl and struck Kisa's arms, Myrae felt something other than defiance stirring quietly beneath her frustration. Something that felt, unmistakably, like the very first crack of an apology she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. If what you just watched moved something in you, that particular, hard-won kind of strength it takes to meet cruelty with patience instead of matching it blow for blow, I want you to drop a heart in the comments right now, because that is exactly the kind of grace worth honoring out loud. And if that feeling is one you'd like to sit inside a little longer, I have 2 full novels waiting for you that will take you even deeper into stories like this one: love, loss, forgiveness, the long road back to family. Both are ready for instant download right now, complete with a free audiobook and every future release in the collection included. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments if you're on your phone. And if you're settled in on the couch tonight, just lift your phone, scan the gold QR code on your screen, and let the story find you. Because in the chapter ahead, Myrae is about to drop something far more painful than a stack of plates, and what falls out from beneath her bed is going to change the way Kisa sees her forever. That crack widened into something Myrae couldn't have predicted 3 days later, on an ordinary afternoon that started like every other afternoon since her sentence began, with sore hands, a growing list of chores, and a quiet, grudging determination not to embarrass herself again in front of the one person in this house who had never once raised her voice at her. She had been assigned to deep clean the prep counter and the cabinet beneath it, a task Kisa had explained simply enough: clear out the shelves, wipe them down, put everything back in its proper place. It was, by the standards of the last few days, almost a relief. No open flame to scorch. No delicate stack of ceramic waiting to shatter the moment she looked away. Just cabinets, rags, and the low hum of the kitchen around her as the afternoon staff moved through their own quiet routines. She knelt in front of the lower cabinet, pulling out mismatched pot lids and a tangle of dish towels that had clearly been shoved in haphazardly by someone in a hurry weeks ago, and reached toward the very back where something soft brushed against her fingers. Fabric, folded, tucked so far into the corner that it seemed almost deliberately hidden, though Myrae had no memory of putting anything like it there herself. She pulled it out without thinking, the way anyone pulls out an unfamiliar object from a dark cabinet, more curious than cautious. It was an apron. Old, faded at the seams, the fabric soft in the particular way fabric gets soft only after years of washing, a small embroidered flower stitched crookedly into one corner. The kind of stitching that belonged to someone who had learned to sew as a hobby, not a trade. Someone who had cared more about the act of making something than the perfection of the result. Myrae's breath caught somewhere in her chest before her mind had even fully caught up to what her hands were holding. She knew this apron. She had spent years believing it was lost, packed away somewhere in storage after the house had been quietly, methodically emptied of anything that might remind a grieving man of the wife he'd lost. Except, apparently, it hadn't been lost at all. It had been hidden. And Myrae understood, with a sudden, sick lurch in her stomach, that she was the one who must have hidden it here herself, years ago. In some half-remembered fog of a night, she'd spent crying in this kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed, tucking the one physical piece of her mother she had left into the darkest corner she could find so that no one, not her father, not the staff, not anyone, could ever take it away from her. She hadn't remembered it was here. She hadn't been able to find it in months, had assumed, with a grief too painful to examine closely, that it had finally been thrown away like everything else. Her hands began to shake. "Where did you get that old apron?" Kisa's voice, calm and curious, came from just behind her, and Myrae spun around too fast, clutching the fabric to her chest like something that might be ripped away if she didn't hold on tightly enough. For a moment, the old instinct rose up in her automatically. The sharp retort, the cold dismissal, the wall she had spent 3 years building brick by brick specifically to keep questions like this one from ever reaching the parts of her that still hurt. But something in Kisa's face stopped her. There was no judgment there, no suspicion, only the same steady patience Myrae had watched her extend toward burnt rice and broken plates, and every insult Myrae had thrown at her over the past week, patience that seemed, in this particular moment, entirely too gentle for the panic clawing up Myrae's throat. "It's mine," Myrae said, too fast, too sharp, the old defenses trying to reassemble themselves even as her voice cracked in the middle of the sentence and gave the lie away completely. Kisa didn't push. She simply lowered herself onto the stool nearby, giving Myrae the space to either continue or retreat, and waited with the same unhurried stillness she brought to everything. It was that stillness, more than any question could have, that finally broke something loose in Myrae's chest. "It was my mother's," she said quietly, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, as though she hadn't spoken them aloud in years because she hadn't. "She used to wear it when she cooked for me. Before," Myrae stopped, swallowed hard, and forced herself to finish. "Before she disappeared, before everyone stopped saying her name in this house like she never existed at all." The kitchen around them had gone quiet, the afternoon staff drifting elsewhere with the particular tact of people who had learned to read a room. And for a moment, it was just the two of them and the old, soft fabric still clutched in Myrae's hands. "I used to sneak down here at night," Myrae continued, staring at the apron rather than at Kisa, because it was easier to say the truth to fabric than to a face. "After everyone was asleep, I'd sit on the floor right there and just hold it. Sometimes I'd cry into it so no one would hear me. I thought if I kept it hidden well enough, nobody could ever take it away and pretend she never mattered." Her voice wavered dangerously. "That's why I hated every maid who came through this kitchen. Every single one of them touched these counters, these cabinets, this whole room that used to be hers, and it felt like they were erasing her a little more every single day, just by being here. Kisa was quiet for a long moment, letting the weight of that confession settle fully before she spoke. And when she finally did, her voice carried none of the pity Myrae had braced herself for, only a quiet, unmistakable recognition. "I lost my father 4 years ago," Kisa said simply. Myrae looked up, startled, the apron still pressed to her chest. "He owned a small restaurant back home," Kisa continued, her eyes distant now, fixed somewhere beyond the kitchen walls. "Nothing fancy, just good food and people who loved him enough to keep coming back, year after year, even when times were hard. He taught me everything I know about cooking, standing right beside me at a stove not much bigger than this one, telling me a kitchen was the one place in the world where you could turn almost nothing into something that made people feel cared for." Her hands, still healing beneath their bandages, folded quietly in her lap. "When he died, the restaurant closed within the year. I couldn't afford to keep it running, and honestly, I couldn't stand to walk through those doors without him behind the counter. I still have his old apron, too. It's folded in the bottom of my suitcase right now, actually. I've carried it with me through 3 different countries because letting go of it felt too much like letting go of him." Myrae stared at her, something shifting behind her eyes. The sudden, disorienting realization that the woman she had tormented for over a week, the woman she had burned with boiling water out of some misguided attempt to protect a grief she didn't even fully understand herself, was carrying an almost identical wound, quietly, without ever once using it as an excuse to hurt anyone else. "You lost your dad, too," Myrae whispered, and here, unspoken, hung the harder question underneath it, the one that would sit with her long after this conversation ended. If Kisa had carried this same kind of pain and never once let it turn her cruel, then what did that say about the choice Myrae herself had made, over and over, every time she chose to hurt someone instead? "I did," Kisa said gently, "and I understand, better than most people ever will, how much it can feel like the whole world expects you to just move on, when moving on was never really the point. Grief doesn't ask permission before it moves in, and it doesn't leave on anyone else's schedule either." She paused, choosing her next words carefully, the way she chose everything. "But Myrae, pain doesn't give you permission to hurt others. I promise you that. I've had every reason in the world to be bitter these past 4 years, and it would have been easy, some days, to let that bitterness spill out onto whoever happened to be standing closest. I chose not to. Not because it was easy, but because I understood that my father wouldn't have wanted that version of me to exist in his memory." Myrae looked down at the apron still clutched in her hands, running her thumb slowly over the crooked, hand-stitched flower in the corner. And for the first time since her mother's disappearance, the tears that rose in her eyes didn't feel like something to hide or swallow down before anyone could see. "I don't know how to stop being angry," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "It's the only thing that's felt like mine since she left." Kisa reached out, slowly, carefully, and rested a bandaged hand on Myrae's shoulder, the same arm this girl had scalded with boiling water less than 2 weeks earlier, and the gesture landed with a weight neither of them fully had words for yet. "Then let's find something else that's yours," Kisa said quietly. "Something that doesn't cost you everyone around you to keep." And there, kneeling on the kitchen floor with her mother's apron pressed against her chest, and the woman she had once tried to break sitting gently beside her, Myrae Seo felt the very first foundation of the wall she'd spent 3 years building begin, at last, to genuinely crack. That crack was still fresh and tender 3 days later, when Myrae heard the one sound she'd been dreading since the moment her father froze her accounts. The bright, familiar chime of the front gate intercom, followed by a voice she knew instantly, calling her name across the courtyard like they were still exactly who they used to be. Hanul had a habit of showing up unannounced whenever she sensed something interesting was happening in someone else's life, and word, apparently, had finally traveled far enough to reach her. Myrae heard the gate buzz open, heard the click of expensive heels crossing the courtyard, and felt her stomach drop with a dread she hadn't expected to feel toward someone she'd once considered her closest friend. She was on her knees at the time, scrubbing the entryway tile with a brush, her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, and a faint sheen of sweat along her hairline from an hour of steady work. She'd gotten better at this over the past week and a half. Not good. Not yet. But better. Competent enough now that Kisa had started trusting her with tasks that didn't end in scorched pans or shattered dishes. There was something in that small, private progress that Myrae had almost started to feel a flicker of pride in. That pride evaporated the instant Hanuel rounded the corner and stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene with wide, delighted eyes. "Oh my God," Hanuel said, and the words came out somewhere between a laugh and a gasp, already reaching for her phone before she'd even finished processing what she was looking at. "Is this real? Is this actually real right now?" Myrae rose slowly from the floor, brush still in hand, painfully aware of the plain gray uniform clinging to her, the raw patches on her palms, the faint smell of cleaning solution that had become as familiar to her lately as her old perfume once was. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment was coming eventually. That word of her punishment would spread through her social circle the way everything eventually spread, whispered between manicured hands over expensive coffee. She simply hadn't expected it to arrive, standing in her own front hallway, with a phone camera already pointed at her. "Hanuel." "No, wait, don't move, I need to get this." Hanuel angled the phone for a better shot, an unmistakable grin spreading across her face, the kind of grin Myrae had once found comforting when it was aimed at someone else. "Everyone at school is going to lose their minds. Look at the little maid princess, scrubbing floors like the help." The laugh that followed cut deeper than Myrae expected, sharper somehow than anything Hanuel had ever said about anyone else, precisely because Myrae understood exactly how this laugh worked. She'd used it herself, dozens of times, aimed at maids who'd done nothing to deserve it beyond simply existing in a house that didn't want them. "Put the phone down," Myrae said, her voice tighter than she meant it to sound. "Are you serious? This is the best thing that's happened all semester." Hanuel circled her slowly, phone still raised, capturing every angle of Myrae's raw hands and cleaning brush and plain, unglamorous uniform. "Wait until everyone sees this. The girl who made 9 maids quit doing laundry herself. This is incredible." "I said put it down." "Why, embarrassed?" Hanuel lowered the phone just enough to meet Myrae's eyes, and something in her expression shifted from delight into something colder, something that had perhaps always been sitting quietly underneath the friendship the entire time, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to surface. "You should be. This is humiliating, Myrae. Your father turned you into a servant over some maid's burnt arm. Do you have any idea how this makes our whole group look? People are already talking." "She has a name," Myrae said quietly, and even she seemed slightly surprised to hear herself say it, the words arriving before she'd fully decided to speak them. "Her name is Kisa, and I hurt her badly enough that I deserved exactly what my father did to me." Hanuel stared at her like she'd started speaking another language entirely. "Wait, are you actually defending the maid right now?" "I'm not defending anyone," Myrae said, though even as the words left her mouth, she understood that wasn't fully true anymore, not after the conversation in the kitchen 3 days ago. Not after sitting on cold tile with her mother's old apron pressed against her chest while a woman she'd once burned told her, gently, that pain didn't give anyone permission to hurt others. "I'm telling you to put the phone away." "Or what?" Hanuel's laugh returned, thinner this time, edged with something almost cruel. "What exactly are you going to do about it, Myrae? You don't have a car anymore, you don't have a phone, you don't even have your own money. What leverage do you possibly think you have left?" The words landed exactly the way Hanuel intended them to, and for a moment Myrae simply stood there, absorbing the full, ugly truth buried underneath them. The realization, quiet and unmistakable, settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. This entire time, had Hanuel ever actually liked her at all, or had every laugh, every arm linked through hers, every whispered secret in a school hallway simply been an investment in access? To money, to status, to a name that opened doors. And now that the money was gone, was this exactly who Hanuel had always been underneath the friendship, waiting for the smallest crack to show itself? "Is this what you called friendship, Hanuel?" Myrae asked, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steadier than she felt. Something flickered across Hanuel's face, not quite guilt, but close enough to it that Myrae could see her friend recognize the accusation for exactly what it was. It didn't last. Hanul straightened, lifted her chin, and raised the phone again, clearly having decided the video was worth more to her than whatever remained of the relationship standing in front of her. "I'm sending this to the group chat," Hanul said. "Everyone deserves to see this." Something in Myrae, some instinct older than the friendship, older even than the anger she'd carried for 3 years, rose up sharp and immediate, and before she'd fully thought it through, she crossed the space between them and closed her hand firmly around Hanul's wrist. "Delete it," Myrae said. "Delete that video before I make you delete it." "Let go of me." Hanul yanked her arm back, genuine surprise flashing across her face at the sudden steel in Myrae's grip, a steel that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, back when Myrae had still believed the whole world owed her deference simply for existing. "You've completely lost it. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not even yourself anymore." "Maybe I'm finally starting to be," Myrae said quietly, and the words surprised her almost as much as they seemed to surprise Hanul, landing in the space between them with a weight neither girl was fully prepared for. For a long moment, the two of them simply stood there in the entryway, the brush still lying forgotten on the tile floor between them, the afternoon light slanting through the windows in a way that felt almost cruelly gentle given everything unraveling beneath it. Then Hanul, without another word, turned on her expensive heels and walked out the way she'd come, phone still clutched tightly in her hand, video very much intact, leaving Myrae standing alone in a hallway that suddenly felt far emptier than it had an hour ago. Myrae sank slowly back down onto the floor beside her abandoned brush, staring at nothing, feeling something crack open inside her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion or sore hands. The sharp, unmistakable sting of finally understanding that the people she'd spent years performing for, competing with, measuring her own worth against, had never once seen her as anything more than an accessory to her father's money. Take away the accessory, and there had been nothing underneath the friendship at all worth keeping. She picked the brush back up with hands that trembled only slightly, and somewhere deep in her chest, underneath the humiliation and the anger, something else was beginning to take root, something that felt, unexpectedly, almost like relief. "Now I want to hear exactly where you land on this, because this story is asking a hard question, and I think you have an answer worth sharing. Some of you watching believe Kaijun should have gone even further, stripped his daughter of everything, cut her off completely, disowned her outright for what she did. Others believe this exact punishment, hard as it's been to watch, is precisely the kind of correction a child like Myrae actually needed to become someone worth knowing. Tell me in the comments, was this the right call, or should Kaijun have gone further? Because in the chapter ahead, Myrae is finally going to walk back into that kitchen and hand Kisa something she has never once given anyone in her entire life, a genuine apology. That relief followed her all the way into the kitchen the next morning, quiet and unfamiliar, sitting in her chest like a small, steady flame she didn't quite trust yet, but no longer wanted to put out. She woke before her alarm, which hadn't happened once in the 2 weeks since her sentence began, and lay in the dark for a moment turning over an idea that had taken root sometime during the walk back from her confrontation with Hanul the day before. She wanted to cook a full meal, start to finish on her own, without Kisa correcting her rice or rescuing her eggs from the bottom of a scorched pan. She wanted, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to make something for someone else simply because she wanted to, not because a schedule taped to her door demanded it. She was in the kitchen by 5, well before her official start time, working quietly in the dim early light with a focus that surprised even her. She remembered everything Kisa had taught her over the past 2 weeks. The rice rinsed until the water ran mostly clear, the flame kept low and patient, the vegetables cut evenly so they'd cook at the same rate instead of some burning while others stayed raw. Her hands, still tender in places from blisters not fully healed, moved with a care she hadn't known she was capable of until she found herself, alone in that kitchen, genuinely trying. She burned nothing. Not the rice, not the vegetables, not the small, simple piece of fish she pan-seared with a nervous kind of concentration, checking it twice as often as necessary. By the time the sun had fully risen, she stood over a finished tray, modest, unglamorous, nothing close to the elaborate meals Kisa herself could produce, but complete and entirely her own. She carried it upstairs to the small guest room where Kisa had been recovering, her arms still healing beneath fresh gauze that got changed every few days, and stood outside the door for a long moment before she found the courage to knock. "Come in," Kisa's voice called, and Myrae pushed the door open with her elbow, balancing the tray carefully, suddenly unsure what to do with the rest of herself. Kisa looked up from the chair by the window, surprise crossing her face at the sight of Myrae standing there with a full breakfast tray instead of a mop or a laundry basket. "What's this?" "I made it," Myrae said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "For you, all of it. I didn't burn anything this time." Something soft moved across Kisa's face, and she set aside the book she'd been reading, gesturing toward the small table near the window. But Myrae didn't cross to it right away. Instead, she found herself lowering to her knees beside the bed, tray still balanced carefully in her hands, in a gesture that felt, even to her, larger than the simple act of serving a meal, an offering, humble and deliberate, from a girl who had never once in her life knelt for anyone. Kisa's eyes softened further, understanding immediately that this wasn't just breakfast. "Myrae." "Please let me say this," Myrae interrupted, and her voice was already beginning to shake, the careful composure she'd carried through the cooking finally starting to crack apart now that the moment had actually arrived. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it for days, and I keep losing my nerve, so I need to just say it now before I lose it again." Kisa nodded slowly and sat back, giving her the space to continue. "I'm sorry for what I did to your arms," Myrae said, and the first tear slipped free before she'd even finished the sentence, tracking down her cheek and landing somewhere on the tray still balanced in her trembling hands. "I think about it every single day. The way you screamed, the way you looked at me right after, like you couldn't believe anyone could actually do something like that on purpose. I did it on purpose, Kisa. I want you to know that I know that. I wasn't confused. I wasn't provoked past some breaking point. I was just cruel, and I chose to be, and I have no excuse good enough to make up for what that water did to your skin." The tears were falling freely now, and Myrae let them, no longer trying to hold the old mask in place the way she'd held it through every confrontation before this one. "It wasn't just the burn," she continued, her voice cracking further. "It was every maid before you too, 9 of them. I made every single one of their lives miserable, and I told myself it was because I was protecting my mother's memory, but that was never really true, was it? I wasn't protecting anything. I was just scared." Her breath hitched, and she had to stop for a moment, pressing her lips together until she could continue. "I was just scared everyone would leave me. My mother left. She didn't mean to, I know that, but she still left, and I think some broken part of me decided that if I never let anyone get close enough to matter, then nobody could ever hurt me by disappearing again. So I hurt them first, every single time. I made sure they left hatting this house before they ever had the chance to leave me the way she did." Kisa was quiet, letting the confession spill out fully, her expression carrying none of the coldness Myrae had once feared, and every ounce of the patience she'd shown from the very first day. "I know an apology doesn't fix your arms," Myrae whispered, staring down at the tray rather than at Kisa's face, unable to hold her gaze through the shame still burning in her chest. "I know it doesn't undo any of it, but I needed you to hear it anyway. I'm sorry, Kisa. I'm so sorry." For a long moment, Kisa said nothing at all. Then she reached out slowly and gently took the tray from Myrae's shaking hands, setting it aside on the small table before turning back to the girl still kneeling on the floor in front of her. "I forgave you the moment you tried to cook," Kisa said softly, and Myrae's head snapped up, startled, meeting her eyes for the first time since the apology began. "Not this morning. 2 weeks ago, the very first time you tried and failed and didn't storm out of that kitchen. I've watched you show up every single day since then, Myrae, even when it hurt, even when I know some part of you wanted to quit and go back to being the girl who never had to try at anything. That's not nothing. That's not something people do unless something real is actually changing inside them." "How can you forgive me so easily?" Myrae asked, her voice raw. "I hurt you. I hurt you badly, and you still sit here and teach me, and you never once made me feel small for it, even when I deserved to. Because I know what it feels like to carry grief nobody taught you how to hold, Kisa said gently, reaching out to rest a bandaged hand against Myre's cheek, wiping away a tear with a tenderness that undid the last of Myre's composure completely. And because holding on to anger toward you wouldn't heal my arms any faster, and it certainly wouldn't have helped you become anyone better. Forgiveness was never really about deciding you didn't hurt me, Myre. It was about deciding I wasn't going to let what you did turn me into someone who couldn't recognize real change when I finally saw it standing in front of me. Myre broke then, fully and completely, the sobs finally arriving with a force she'd been holding back for 3 long years. Not just for the burn, not just for the cruelty, but for her mother, for the friendship that had turned out to be hollow. For every night she'd cried alone into a hidden apron because she believed no one in the world would ever understand exactly what she'd lost. Kisa pulled her into an embrace, careful of her healing arms but steady all the same, and let the girl cry against her shoulder the way, perhaps, no one had let her cry in the 3 long years since her mother disappeared. You're allowed to grieve her, Kisa murmured against Myre's hair, holding her through the shaking. You're allowed to miss her every single day for the rest of your life, but you don't have to keep punishing the rest of the world for a loss that was never their fault. You get to choose something different now, and from where I'm sitting, it looks like you already have. If you believe what you just watched was real, not performance, not manipulation, but a genuine, hard-won moment of a broken young woman finally choosing to become someone better, type, "Everyone can change," in the comments right now, because moments like this one deserve to be witnessed out loud. Because in the chapter ahead, this fragile new piece is about to be tested in front of the very people who once mocked Myre for losing everything. And this time, she isn't going to back down. That choice was put to the test faster than Myre expected, because within the week, her father announced that the estate would host one of the most important gatherings of the year. A formal banquet for his closest business associates, the kind of evening that required flawless execution from every corner of the house, and Kaijun had made it clear, without a hint of hesitation, that Kisa would be the one running the kitchen. "You're certain," he'd asked her once, the only time he questioned the decision at all, "that your arms are healed enough for a night like this?" "I'm certain," Kisa had answered, and there had been no doubt in her voice at all. Myre spent the days leading up to the banquet working harder than she had at any point since her sentence began, not out of obligation this time, but because some part of her had quietly decided she wanted this night to matter, wanted Kisa's first major test in this house to be a triumph, not merely a survival. She prepped vegetables until her hands ached in the old, familiar way, memorized the order of every course, learned to anticipate what Kisa needed before she even had to ask for it. For the first time since she'd walked into that kitchen in a plain gray uniform, she felt something that resembled genuine pride in the work itself, rather than simple relief at having avoided disaster. The guest list, when it was finally posted near the staff entrance, included a name that made Myre's stomach tighten the moment she saw it. Hanul's family had been invited, a courtesy extended to one of her father's longtime business partners rather than any particular fondness for the daughter. And Myre understood immediately that whatever piece she had found in that kitchen over the past 2 weeks was about to be tested in front of an audience far larger than one video ever could have reached. The evening itself unfolded with the kind of quiet grandeur only a house like the CO estate could produce. Long tables dressed in white linen beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. The low murmur of powerful men and their families exchanging pleasantries over crystal glasses. The entire mansion transformed for one night into something between a fortress and a stage. Myre moved through the kitchen in her uniform, carrying trays and calling out orders exactly as Kisa had trained her. And if any of the guests recognized the mafia boss's daughter working service that night, none of them said so aloud, though she caught more than a few curious glances trailing after her as she passed. It was during the final stretch of preparation, with the main course only minutes from being plated, that Myre noticed Hanul slip away from her family's table and drift, with far too much purpose for someone simply looking for a restroom, toward the narrow service hallway that led back into the kitchen. Myrae followed instinctively, some old, sharp instinct from years of reading Hanul's expressions, telling her that this was not an innocent detour. She reached the kitchen doorway just in time to see Hanul standing near the counter where Kisa's signature sauce sat resting in a wide copper pan, finished, seasoned to perfection after hours of careful reduction, and to see Hanul's hand already extended toward a small glass jar of something Myrae didn't immediately recognize, something clearly not meant to be anywhere near that sauce. "Keep your hands off Kisa's kitchen." Myrae's voice cracked through the room sharp enough to make two of the kitchen staff jump, and Hanul froze mid-motion, caught entirely off guard by the volume and force behind it. "Relax," Hanul said, recovering quickly, though the guilt flickering across her face gave her away completely. "It's just a little salt. Consider it a favor. Everyone's about to find out the great Kisa Kane can't actually cook under pressure, and honestly, I think it'll do you some good, watching her fail for once instead of following her around like a puppy." "Put it down," Myrae said, closing the distance between them in a few quick steps, her voice steady despite the fury rising in her chest. "Why do you even care?" Hanul demanded, genuinely baffled, the jar still hovering dangerously close to the sauce. "She's a maid, Myrae. In a few years, none of this will even matter. You'll go back to your real life and she'll go back to being nobody, exactly like she was before she walked through your gates." Something in Myrae went very still and very clear in that moment, the last remaining trace of the girl who might once have agreed with that sentence finally, fully extinguished. "She's twice the human being you'll ever be," Myrae said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "She's spent 2 weeks teaching me things you never once bothered to: patience and honesty, and what it actually looks like to care about someone without wanting something from them in return. You came into my house tonight to sabotage a woman who has never done a single thing to you, just to make yourself feel powerful for 5 minutes. That's not friendship, Hanul. That's not even close to being a decent person." Hanul's face flushed, humiliation and anger warring visibly across her features, but before she could respond, Myrae reached out and closed her hand firmly around the jar, taking it from her grip with a steadiness that left no room for argument. "Get out of this kitchen," Myrae said, "and if I ever see you anywhere near Kisa's work again, I will make sure my father hears about exactly what you tried to do tonight, in front of every single guest at that table." For a long moment, Hanul simply stared at her, clearly recalculating whatever plan she'd walked in with, before finally turning and storming back toward the dining hall without another word, her heels clicking sharp and fast against the tile. Kisa, who had witnessed the entire exchange from across the kitchen with a plate in each hand, set the plates down carefully and crossed to where Myrae stood, still holding the small jar like evidence of a crime narrowly prevented. "You didn't have to do that," Kisa said quietly, though her eyes carried something warm and unmistakably proud. "Yes, I did," Myrae said simply, and there was no hesitation in it at all. Here, quietly, sat the question the evening hadn't fully answered yet. If Myrae was willing to stand this firmly for Kisa in front of her own oldest friend, what exactly would she be willing to risk once her father's most important guests sat down to taste the meal she'd helped prepare, and the entire syndicate's judgment came down to whether that meal succeeded or failed? The plating resumed with fresh urgency, Kisa moving through the final steps with the same focused calm she brought to everything, Myrae working beside her without a single misstep, the two of them falling into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, less like supervisor and subordinate and entirely like two people who trusted each other completely. When the dishes were finally carried out to the long banquet table, the kitchen staff watching from the doorway with quiet anticipation, the room outside fell into the particular hush that settles over a table full of powerful people about to render judgment. Kaijun lifted the first bite to his mouth, and the pause that followed stretched long enough that Myrae, watching from the kitchen doorway with her heart pounding, thought for one terrible second that something had gone wrong after all. Then her father set down his fork, looked directly at Kisa standing quietly near the kitchen entrance, and spoke loud enough for the entire table to hear. "This meal is perfection, Kaijun." "Wait, no." He said it about himself. "Let me say it properly. Kaijun looked at Kisa and declared to the whole table, "This meal is perfection." And around him, one by one, his most powerful, most difficult-to-impress guests began nodding their agreement, murmurs of genuine praise rippling down the length of the table, several reaching for second helpings before their plates were even half finished. Myrae felt something swell in her chest that had nothing to do with pride in herself, and everything to do with pride in the woman standing beside her, until she glanced toward the far end of the table and caught sight of Hanul's mother leaning close to her husband, whispering something behind a raised hand, her expression sharp and calculating in a way that made the small hairs rise on the back of Myrae's neck. Because whatever Hanul had failed to accomplish in that kitchen tonight, Myrae realized with a slow, creeping dread, her mother looked very much like a woman who had absolutely no intention of letting the matter end here. That creeping dread lingered through the rest of the banquet. Though nothing came of it that night, no scene, no confrontation, only Hanul's mother rising from the table an hour later with a tight, unreadable smile and a quiet word of thanks to Kaijun for his hospitality. The kind of pleasantry powerful people exchange when they've decided a battle isn't worth fighting in public. Whatever she'd been whispering to her husband stayed exactly where she left it, and as the last of the guests filed out through the estate's tall iron gates that night, Myrae found herself standing beside Kisa in the quiet aftermath, both of them still in their kitchen whites, watching the taillights disappear down the long drive. "You're worried about something," Kisa said, catching the tension still lingering in Myrae's shoulders. "Hanul's mother," Myrae admitted. "She looked like a woman who wasn't finished." Kisa considered that for a moment, then offered the same steady calm she brought to everything. "Some people spend their whole lives finding new ways to be small," she said. "We'll handle whatever comes if anything comes at all. Tonight was a win, and I think we've earned the right to simply enjoy it." It was, Myrae realized, the first time in 3 years she'd allowed herself to fully accept a good night for exactly what it was, without immediately bracing for whatever might come to ruin it. The weeks that followed passed with a rhythm Myrae had never known a household could have. Kisa's burns healed slowly but completely, the angry red marks fading first to pink, and then, eventually, to thin pale lines she wore without any apparent self-consciousness, evidence of a wound that had ultimately built something rather than only breaking it. Kaijun kept a closer eye on the kitchen after the banquet than he ever had before, not out of suspicion, but out of something that looked, more and more, like genuine admiration for the woman who had walked into his chaotic household and calmly refused to be broken by any part of it. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, sunlight pouring through the tall kitchen windows, that Kaijun asked Kisa to join him in his study, and Myrae, who had learned by now to recognize the particular quality of silence that preceded something important in this house, found an excuse to linger near the doorway just close enough to hear. "Your visa renews in 3 months, Kaijun said, and Myrae could hear the careful formality in his voice, the tone he used when he was working up to something that mattered to him more than he wanted to admit. "I understand your goal has always been to finish your degree and open a restaurant of your own." "It has," Kisa said. "It still is." "I'd like to help make that happen," Kaijun said. "Not as your employer, as a partner. I'll finance the space, the equipment, whatever it takes to get the doors open properly, and you'll run it exactly the way you see fit, with full ownership alongside my investment. No strings beyond a fair partnership, and no expectation that you'll continue working in this house a single day longer than you want to." There was a pause long enough that Myrae, still hovering near the doorway, found herself holding her breath along with it. "Why would you do that?" Kisa asked finally, and there was no suspicion in the question, only genuine curiosity. "Because you walked into a house that had already broken 9 people before you," Kaijun said quietly, "and instead of breaking, you rebuilt something none of us thought was possible to save. My daughter." His voice caught just slightly on the words. "You gave me my daughter back, Miss Kane. That is not a debt I intend to leave unpaid." Myrae, listening from the hallway with her hand pressed lightly against the doorframe, felt her eyes sting with a sudden rush of tears she hadn't expected, and it occurred to her, standing there, that this was perhaps the first time she had ever heard her father speak about her with something other than exhausted disappointment in his voice. "You don't work for us anymore," Kai-jun continued, and Myrae could hear the warmth breaking fully through his usual composure now. "You're our partner, and if you're willing to have her, I think my daughter would like to keep learning from you, restaurant or not." Myrae stepped fully into the doorway then, no longer bothering to hide that she'd been listening, and found Kisa already looking toward her with an expression that held equal parts surprise and quiet warmth. "Would you," Kisa asked her directly, "keep learning, I mean, even once this isn't a punishment anymore?" "I'd like that more than almost anything," Myrae said, and meant it completely. The restaurant took shape over the following months, a modest storefront in a quiet part of the city that Kisa transformed, piece by piece, into exactly the kind of place her father would have been proud to call his own: warm lighting, honest food. A menu that blended the flavors of her childhood with the techniques she'd spent years perfecting far from home. Myrae spent every free hour there that her school schedule allowed, no longer wearing a plain gray uniform out of obligation, but a chef's apron she'd chosen for herself, learning knife work and sauces, and the particular patience good cooking demanded, standing beside the woman who had somehow, against every possible expectation, become something closer to family than anyone else left in her life besides her father. On opening night, the small restaurant filled with a mix of Kai-jun's closest associates, curious neighbors, and the handful of household staff who had watched this entire transformation unfold from the very beginning, several of them wiping away tears of their own as they watched Myrae move confidently through the kitchen alongside Kisa, calling out orders, plating dishes, entirely unrecognizable as the girl who had once hurled scalding water across that same kind of counter in a fit of unaddressed grief. Kai-jun stood near the entrance for most of the evening, watching his daughter work with a quiet, unguarded pride he'd rarely allowed himself to show in all the years since his wife's disappearance. When Myrae finally slipped away from the kitchen for a moment during a lull in service, she found him standing there, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Are we finally a family again?" Myrae asked quietly, the question carrying more weight in it than either of them had spoken aloud in 3 long years. Kai-jun's composure finally broke, just slightly, and he pulled his daughter into an embrace that felt, to both of them, like the first honest one they'd shared since her mother had still been alive to hold them both together. "We are," he said, his voice thick. "We truly are." Later that night, after the last guests had gone and the kitchen had finally gone quiet, Myrae found her mother's old apron folded neatly in her bag where she now carried it everywhere. A piece of the past she no longer needed to hide beneath a cabinet in the dark. She ran her thumb over the crooked, hand-stitched flower one more time before tucking it carefully away, understanding now that carrying grief and building a future had never actually been opposites at all. She looked around the small, warmly lit restaurant, Kisa wiping down the last counter with the same careful pride she brought to everything, her father lingering by the door in quiet conversation with the staff who had once feared setting foot in his estate, the whole strange, hard-won family that had somehow grown out of a single act of cruelty 2 months ago, and felt something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't felt in 3 long years. "This house isn't empty anymore," she whispered to herself, though she meant far more than just the mansion behind her. She meant the whole of what they'd built together, brick by brick, apology by apology, and it was, she realized, the truest thing she'd said in a very long time. If watching a spoiled bully finally learn real humility, real accountability, and real love gave you even half the satisfaction it gave me writing it, hit that subscribe button right now, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. And if this particular kind of story, grief turning into grace, cruelty turning into family, is exactly the feeling you want to sit inside a little longer, I have 2 more novels ready for you tonight, full of that same love, loss, and hope. They're available for instant download right now, audiobook included, every future release in the collection folded in at no extra cost. The link is waiting in the description and pinned at the top of the comments if you're on your phone, and if you're curled up on the couch tonight, just lift your phone, scan the gold QR code right there on your screen, and let the next story find you the way this one just did. Thank you for walking through every single one of these chapters with me. I'll see you in the next one.